Hi, I'm Christopher Wolfe. I'm president of the American Public Philosophy Institute. And one of my many pleasant duties in that capacity is interviewing our very interesting speakers when they come to town here at the University of Dallas. And today we have Sam Gregg, who's at the Acton Institute, the director of research there. And we want to talk a little bit about Sam's background, his past, his intellectual autobiography, so to speak. So it started out, as people will understand when they hear you, I suppose, back in Australia, and you went to school there. I guess you got an MA at the University of Melbourne, right? So what did you study there, and why were you studying that?
Well, I was interested in philosophy and politics and economics, what people used to call PPE, so to speak, because I thought that that covered philosophy, politics and economics, pretty much covered everything that you really needed to know. Philosophy, the sort of fundamental things, politics, which is all about what type of regime we live under, and economics, which influences our lives, I think, much more than we often realize. And what I was interested in was the integration of these things. And in fact, all through my writings, I've always tried to adopt a type of multidisciplinary approach, because I think that's helpful in overcoming things like the excessive fragmentation I think you find of knowledge in much of the academy today, and also because all truth is all ultimately integrated at some level. So to that extent, I was interested in exploring some of these things. And by philosophy, it was things like Aristotle, it was people like Aquinas, Plato, some of the classics. But I also looked at some of the more modern thinkers as well, someone like Adam Smith, for example, who wasn't just an economist, but began really as a philosopher in the first place. So those were some of the things that I was interested in. But what was missing in many respects, I think, was a systematic exposure and study of natural law theory, which I think is where I begin with most questions and where I usually end up as well.
And I guess that probably helps to explain how you wended your way from Australia to England then.
That's right. I ended up doing a DPhil at Oxford. A DPhil is what Oxford calls a doctorate. And I did it under the supervision of a fellow named John Finnis, who is Australian by birth, actually. Yes. People often don't know that. But I wanted to work with him because I was very interested in his particular take on natural law theory. Secondly, because I think he probably is, even though some people might disagree with his particular take on natural law, I think it's hard to dispute that he's probably the most influential living natural law thinker today. And I think his book, Natural Law and Natural Rights, will be a classic for a very, very long time. And also because he had a reputation for rigor, which was extremely helpful, because when he would read papers I'd written or would listen to my thoughts about different things, he would very quickly make it clear when it was incoherent or made no sense, or perhaps you should read this because it will fundamentally shift your thinking on that issue, or whatever it happens to be. And I also knew that if I could get my DPhil thesis past him, I wasn't going to have any problem with the examiners.
Right. You know, I have another friend who studied with John Finnis, and he said that the first time he sat down with him to go through one of his pieces of writing, the student had written something out. He said it was quite an extraordinary experience having somebody with a really sharp mind go through a piece of writing, and you learn an awful lot.
Very quickly.
It can be a little bit embarrassing at times, but also very rewarding too. So where then after Oxford, where did you go from there?
I finished my doctorate in 1998, and I went back to Australia, and I worked in a think tank there for 2 years. A secular think tank. It wasn't a religiously oriented
What was
group.
it?
It was a conservative free market think tank that was interested in free market and conservative ideas, both at the level of what you might call the public intellectual level, but also at the level of policy. So I was writing a great deal about the intersection of philosophy and economics, which is more or less what my doctoral thesis had been on.
What was it on, or what was the
Well, I was looking very, very closely at natural law and economics, and a fair amount of that was read through the lens of Catholic social teaching, because Catholic social teaching is where you find a lot of integration of natural law theory, as well as the insights of contemporary economics, as well as an account of economic history, if you like. So it really was very much a political economy exercise in the way that that phrase used to be understood. So I was working there for 2 years, and then I was offered a position at the Acton Institute in the United States, and I
How
took
did
it.
that come about?
I was at a conference in Santiago, Chile, and I got an email from the president of the Acton Institute, a Catholic priest named Father Robert Sirico, saying, "We're doing a conference on globalization in Rome with one of the pontifical dicasteries. Would you like to come?" And I said, "Sure. When is it?" 2 weeks' time. So I got on a plane and flew back to Sydney, and then from Sydney to Rome. And the conference was great, but it was also when I was offered this position at the Acton Institute. And I took the position, and I've been there ever since.
So I guess you must enjoy it.
It's very interesting work because Acton's work is not just focused upon the United States. Obviously, I'd say at least 60% of our work is within the United States, whether it's the research arm that I head up or whether it's the programs work that we do or the different media outreach that we do. But we also have an office in Buenos Aires, in Argentina. We have an office in Rome. I'd say about 40% of our work now is outside the United States, working primarily with religious leaders, both clerical and lay, Catholic, evangelical, Eastern Orthodox, Jewish as well, in trying to help religious leaders get a better grasp of what economics can teach them about the social and economic problems that any religious leader at some point is going to be asked about, whether it's by members of their flock or by journalists who are interested in what they have to say about these sorts of issues.
You know, I guess Western Europe might be a pretty hard nut to crack for you if you want to try to promote a kind of free market understanding of economics, because I think a lot of Europeans find American attitudes on economics either puzzling or, perhaps put more, harshly, immoral in a way.
Sure.
They're not sufficiently attentive to the concerns of real human beings.
Right. Yes, Western Europe is an interesting case because it's not just that you're dealing with a certain degree of skepticism about the markets, free markets. You're also dealing with a high degree of skepticism about moral truth as well. So it's not just that you're having to show people how markets work in ways that, say, welfare states generally don't work. You have to also convince some of these audiences it's a thing called moral objectivity, there's truth, you can know it, and reason is important. And even understandings of natural law are quite weak in Western Europe. Not so much Central and Eastern Europe, because that's quite different. But in Western Europe, these things are very weak. And it's partly driven, at least on the economic level, by an association of the market with what I think are in many respects caricatures of the United States and the Anglo-American world. But also, I have to say, a tendency in much of Western Europe to look to the state as the first point of recourse when you're dealing with any number of social and economic problems. So if you have a problem with your neighbor, you write to the minister in Paris or Berlin rather than going and talking to your neighbor about it. Now, that's an exaggeration, but that's the type of mentality. It's a state-first mentality. And you can understand that because if you've lived in Western Europe and you think about the history of Western Europe in the 20th century, so 2 world wars, Holocaust, the rise of communism, fascism, etc., you can see why people would be skeptical about the benefits of freedom and why, if you ask a typical Western European audience, what do you prefer, security or liberty, overwhelmingly, you know they're going to say security. Whereas in America, at least in most parts of America, I think still, people will still tend to say liberty rather than security. And Europeans have made a trade-off. They've traded off security for liberty, but of course they don't actually really have security because these welfare states have to be paid for, and these policies of mass wealth redistribution have very negative effects on the capacity of these countries to create wealth, and then they're not replicating themselves either. That demographic problem, I think, is reflective of many European attitudes, Western European attitudes towards life, towards economic life, and even to the way they think about politics and the way they think about the future, which they don't think about for the most part. They don't really think in terms of what will this mean for my children or my grandchildren or future generations. It's very much about me, myself, and I right now.
Yeah. If it's true that the welfare state, the social democratic state in Europe is creating these economic problems, why is it do you think that they tend to be closed to free market solutions? Why do they assume that those solutions are going to actually worsen the situation rather than improving it?
Well, one is that social democracy is the orthodoxy when it comes to thinking about economic and political problems. It's the default position, in a way that Americans will tend to be more inclined to think about free market approaches to things before thinking about social democratic approaches. So that's the first thing. There's a default social democratic mentality. I think also another big thing to keep in mind is that it was once put to me that America was built from the bottom up, whereas much of modern Europe was built from the top down by elites, by people who believe they have a responsibility to run the rest of society for everyone else. And this is reflected in, for example, the way that you see the European Union, particularly the European Union headquarters and the countless organizations associated with the European Union in Brussels. It's very much a top-down exercise, which means the emphasis is upon command and control. It's not upon freedom. It's not upon bottom-up civil society, free market solutions. It's much more about top-down approaches. Whereas America is different. America was built pretty much from the bottom up. So I think that is another reason why you see this default move towards the state. I think a third thing is that when you talk about free markets in Europe, that is often associated with, I think, often caricatures of 19th century capitalism. Now, there's lots of bad things that happened as a consequence of industrial capitalism. There's also a lot of good things as well. People lived longer, had healthier lives, often had more opportunity that they didn't have in pre-industrial Europe, where most people are living in rural lifestyles, where they rarely move more than 5 miles beyond their village for their entire lives, etc., etc. So I think a lot of Europeans have bought into many of the myths I think you find about 19th century capitalism that you read, for example, in the novels of Charles Dickens or the novels of Émile Zola. And so this sort of very negative, bad press that capitalism has, I think that's another reason why there's this suspicion of the market and a general tendency to distrust putting faith in people's freedom to be able to resolve many of their problems for themselves.
There seems to be some pushback these days. I think of Brexit, for example, and then the pushback in Germany with respect to the immigration policy. But I guess I'm not so sure that that translates into any institutional ongoing response. That is, what would it take to build up civil society in Europe? And how in Eastern Europe, for example, do we see any kind of movement toward building up civil society in the wake of communism there?
Yeah, they're good questions. The Brexit thing is very interesting because the people who voted for Brexit in Britain did so for different reasons. So some of them clearly did so because of the refusal of the European Union in many respects to control the borders of the European Union, and Germany's decision, Chancellor Merkel's decision, to more or less say, if you get to Germany, you're welcome. And for many people in Britain, that was, okay, these countries have abandoned borders, they've abandoned sovereignty, because that's actually what borders are about. It's about sovereignty, which means you're willing to give up control of who is the authority, really, so to speak, in a given political context. So that's one thing. Other people voted for Brexit because they're free market people and they're tired of all these regulations coming from Brussels, which people in Britain have not agreed to. There were questions about, many people voted in favour of Brexit because they sensed that if we do not do this now, the constant erosion of our sovereignty will simply accelerate. Another reason, of course, is that continental Europe is not in good economic shape right now. It's just not. It's some of the lowest growth rates in the world, high levels of unemployment, and many people were looking across the channel and thinking, really? Do we really want to be shackled to this? So people voted for Brexit for often quite different and sometimes contradictory reasons as well. And in Western Europe, of course, you're also seeing the rise of what you might call anti-establishment groups, anti-elite groups, more populist groups. And of course we see that in the United States today, but in the case of Europe, it's either a populism of the right, which sometimes turns into this type of nationalism, which is generally nationalism in itself as opposed to patriotism, which is nationalism is generally unhealthy, or left-wing populism. So in countries like Spain and Italy, the populism there tends to be of the left-wing variety, whereas in Germany, Austria, Hungary, it tends to be much more, and France, of course, it tends to be much more of the right-wing flavour. But what they have in common is anger with the establishment, anger with the European Union, anger with the sense that there are groups of people who, whether they're on the right or on the left, are controlling these nations' destiny, and they are completely out of touch with normal people who are not part of what's often called the political class. In terms of your question about Eastern Europe, what I see there is that, of course, civil society was destroyed by communism.
Yeah.
And to an extent, that means two things. One is people in Central and Eastern Europe, in many respects, tend to be more skeptical about the state because they saw what happened in the case of communism. But they're also in some respects highly fragmented societies because building civil society up from the ground up is a very difficult exercise, and the older generation of Eastern Europeans are simply not used to that. In fact, they tend in many respects to vote for some of the former communist parties. It's the younger people who are more inclined to take a more free market approach, a more limited government approach, and often are quite pro-American in a way that you don't find, for example, in some Western European countries. So Eastern and Central Europe has its own particular problems, but I think it's got its own opportunities as well.
Shifting to America, you work for an institute that's really focused especially on the intersection of religion and liberty and free markets. And so I guess I want to step back a little bit and ask about the current state of American ideas about these topics. And I think especially of the challenge of giving some kind of interpretation to the Great Recession a number of years ago, because it seems to me that that's actually solidified a lot of very strong anti-market sentiment, especially among young people.
Right.
It's this fundamental distrust. How do you deal with that?
Well, that's a big question which we at the Acton Institute have been dealing with for quite a while, and it plays out in different ways. One of the reasons I wrote a book called Becoming Europe, which came out in 2013, was I was arguing that what we've seen, particularly since 2008, is an acceleration of what might be called European perspectives on these things. By that, I more or less mean social democratic, Rousseauian, fixation with equality, distrust of markets, etc., etc. And some of those mindsets are clearly present in large segments of opinion in the United States today. California, the northeast coast of the United States, the city of Chicago. All these places, geographically speaking, I think, have more or less gone down that path, which is also one of the reasons most of those places are also in significant economic trouble. But to get to your point, this distrust of markets is, I think, partly reflective of people's interpretation of the 2008 recession. And were there bad things going on? Absolutely. There was a lot of misbehavior going on in financial markets, in financial houses, in investment banking, etc., etc. Well, what's not often talked about is just how much of this was enabled by bad government policy. So, for example, when you keep interest rates at very low for 8 years, that means there's going to be a lot of extra money floating around in the economy, and guess what? It's going to go into things like the housing market and create bubbles, and all bubbles at some point will come to an end. Then you had the way in which the federal government, through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, was in many respects fueling this housing boom. That's another reason. A third reason I'd suggest is that many of the regulations that we have in place in the financial market, they actually often become very counterproductive. I mean, that's the thing that it's very hard for people who don't think about things economically to understand that sometimes regulations which you design for a purpose can have very counterproductive effects. So if you say things like, banks, you must lend whatever percentage of your loan portfolio to people of a particular background, then that means that you are no longer, the bank is no longer able to assess whether people of that particular background can actually pay back their loans in the first place. And so some of that regulation goes back to the 1990s and the Clinton administration, the Bill Clinton administration. But so my point is the way in which bad regulations, bad government policy, and a lot of intervention pushed some of these factors that came to the fore in 2008, I think are not well understood. But they're clearly there. Anyone who's studied the economic history of this period, you soon realize that a lot of this was caused, not exclusively, but a lot of it was caused by a government intervention. So if one is to rehabilitate a more favorable view of free markets, I think that means increasing understanding of how bad government policy contributed to some of these problems. Another issue, I think, which is associated with this is the rise of this almost a fixation with equality that we're seeing throughout the United States, which has been in Europe for a very long time. And I think that has something to do with, certainly with some of the things that have happened economically. But also I think it reflects the influence of some really pernicious political ideas. We're seeing Rawlsianism flowing out now from out of Harvard and really influencing large segments of the political class, but also large segments of public opinion about these issues. And of course there are legitimate forms of equality. Equality before the law, the rule of law depends on the idea that we're all equal before the law, etc., etc. But I think we're seeing the spread of what you might call this egalitarian mindset, which goes along in many respects with a high degree of envy, something we don't hear our religious leaders talk very much about. But there's a sense that equality is always good and inequality is always unjust. And neither of those two propositions are true. But they're very attractive to people. I mean, who's going to say, I'm against equality? Not many people are going to get up and say that. But when you think about it, if you have a fixation with equality, that's going to have some bad political consequences, I think, but also some bad economic consequences, especially when it comes to the way you think about wealth creation and the way that, and what you're prepared to tolerate in terms of wealth redistribution, because wealth redistribution, which is often done in the name of some form of equalization, has consequences for wealth creation. If you tax people at 50%, 60%, it's going to have an impact upon whether they're going to start a business in the first place at all.
So when you think about the critique of capitalism in the wake of the Great Recession, in addition to the government actions that help to stimulate it, some people also say, but isn't this also something that's endemic to a market economy, that you have
booms
exuberant
and busts,
spirits and then crashes and kind of the back and forth? And it seems to me we were almost operating under the illusion after such a long, good run in the, by and large in the 80s and 90s, in the early 2000s, that we were, assuming, hey, maybe we've kind of got the knack now that we can kind of even this out and avoid the ups and downs.
As long as we have Alan Greenspan, everything's going to be fine. No, seriously. I mean, the
that's
notion.
what it felt like, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, no, I think this is a real issue because obviously no one wants to have recessions, certainly no one wants to have depressions, but there is a cyclical nature to the way that economies, particularly capitalist economies, work. And a lot of work in the 1930s and 1940s was on this very subject of business cycle theory, how economies grow at different points, and when people start to become over-exuberant, or when they take on too much debt, or whether they invest too much in a particular area, where they start losing their critical apparatus, there's a correction that will come. And that, to a certain extent, is normal. To a certain extent, when we talk about market correction, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about some of this exuberance and some of these bad decisions being disciplined by market forces. And that's generally a good thing. You don't want to have, you don't want to be looking to other areas of life to discipline the way in which market corrections occur. So that's, I think you're certainly right. We also, I think, the other problem which is part of this, though, is that we live in political societies in which we expect the state to smooth these things out as much as they can. And to a certain extent, things like central banking can do that with the way that they regulate the level of interest being charged. Or even things like government spending programs. They can do some things in this regard. But the notion that you can control these things completely, I think, is just mistaken. And sometimes some of these policies can actually cause the correction to be much harsher than it otherwise would be. So, for example, if the Federal Reserve had started raising interest rates in, say, 2005, 2006, rather than in 2007, my guess is that the 2008 recession would not have been as bad as it was, because the housing market would have been much, at a much lower, the bubble would have been progressively deflated in a way that it wasn't being deflated. So, you know, while governments can do some things in this regard, expecting that they can control the market in that way, well, you can, but that's called a command economy. And that comes with a whole range of other problems which we certainly don't want.
So where are we now? I mean, we have two candidates, neither of whom could really be called a devotee of the free market, I don't think. And so, you know, what do you see for the American future here?
Mm-hmm. It's not looking good, actually. Why do I say that? Well, several reasons. One is, I think we have a real problem of crony capitalism. Both presidential candidates reflect that to varying degrees and in different ways. I think applying the label crony capitalist to the two main presidential candidates is a fair and accurate description of what they actually do. And by crony capitalism, what I mean, of course, is the notion that you don't advance economically by creating a new product or service that other people want to buy. You get ahead by cultivating relationships with politicians, with regulators, getting legislation to benefit you, et cetera, et cetera. That's the type of thinking that is increasingly prevalent in large segments of the American business community. You find that particularly in the northeast coast of the United States. It's how things are done in a city like Chicago, for example. But there's a price you pay for that. The price you pay is lack of competitiveness. People who are interested in entrepreneurship will often, as an economic entrepreneurship, will leave. They'll go and find somewhere else. Or, worse, they'll turn their entrepreneurial skills into becoming political entrepreneurs, and they'll focus very much about, okay, I'm very good at being creative. Let's see how creative I can be in getting a bunch of legislators to pass a tariff that's going to benefit my sector of the economy and block others out. Now, that all said, what I think is missing from the free market case is an acknowledgement, and I'm very much a free marketer, I'm very much a free trader, is an acknowledgement that free trade is always about the long term. It progressively reduces prices for everyone, especially those people who are poor. But there are losers. short-term losers from free trade. So the Pennsylvania steelworker, or the West Virginia coal miner, or particular segments of the manufacturing world. They, in a context of global competition, suddenly find that it's much harder for them to compete against people from, say, China or India who are willing to work harder and longer at jobs that a lot of Americans don't actually want to do anymore. So there's a political dimension to free trade and opening up of markets, which is very clear that free markets and globalization reduce poverty. They have in many respects taken millions of people out of poverty in a relatively short period of time. But in developed economies like the United States, there are these negative side effects. And it's not clear to me that free marketers have worked out how to deal with some of this, because the standard response is, well, in 10 years' time, the market will have fixed this problem because these people will have moved, they've gone into another sector of the economy, et cetera, et cetera. And that's true in many cases, but in some cases it's not. And so free trade means that you have to be willing to tolerate a higher degree of economic insecurity. And that's hard for some people, right? If you're a 55-year-old coal miner, you just can't go and start a tech business. It's just not that simple. So that is not a reason, in my view, to have government programs to try and resolve those sorts of problems, because I think government programs generally don't work in that area, and there's not a lot of evidence that they do. But free marketers, I think, have to be much cleverer and more thoughtful in thinking about how they make the case for free markets in light of the realities of these side effects, and also thinking about creative ways for dealing with these side effects in ways that are consistent with principles of liberty. And that's hard. It's not immediately obvious what comes to mind. But I think that's something that the free market case is going to have to pick up on. Otherwise, you're going to find more and more Americans turning against market principles, and particularly free trade.
And can you think of particular instances or examples of how free market advocates have thought about dealing with problems like that?
Yes, but most of the people who wrote about that subject wrote about it 70, 80 years ago. And they, people like Wilhelm Röpke and a good number of German economists, free market economists, in the context of Germany in the 1920s and the 1930s, where they're arguing for free trade in the midst of very high levels of unemployment, where German industry is facing all sorts of problems. And they more or less came up with what you might call civil society solutions. They also, but their main focus was making the costs and the process of transition as quick and as relatively painless as possible, so that you don't make the mistake of encouraging, say, the 25-year-old that he can, the 25-year-old in West Virginia, that he can expect that he can go and work in the coal mine and have a secure job for the rest of his life. That's just a mindset and an attitude that doesn't fit in a dynamic market society. So I think they came up with ideas about, we need to make these transitions as quick as possible rather than trying to sort of delay things and placate particular groups, and to make the process of transition smooth so that people can, if they're young enough, get up and move somewhere else and do something different. But it's not simple. It's not simple.
What do you do that's quick and provides a quick transition for the 55-year-old coal miner?
Right. No, there is no question that there are losers from the process of economic globalization in the United States. And I think it's silly for free marketers to pretend that it's not. Now, the benefits of free trade, I think, part of the problem is the benefits of free trade are in many respects invisible, right? We don't really notice that clothes are a lot cheaper, or food is a lot cheaper, or that the cost of cell phones, which we all use, has declined dramatically, and that's because of competition, et cetera, et cetera. But free traders are often not very good at making that case. And often it's an appeal to liberty, which is great, but there's often not a very good explanation in terms that people can understand about the benefits of these sorts of things.
It certainly seems to be true that insofar as Republicans tend to be the more free market-oriented party, that that they didn't really do a very good job of trying to show how it is that the people who are kind of caught in the creative destruction of the market could really kind of deal with these difficult circumstances. And I think that's one reason for the shape of our politics in 2016.
Absolutely, and it also is the case that many of the people who have benefited immensely from opening up of markets and free trade are often quite progressive in their social views. So, for example, the group that we often associate with markets, free trade, globalization, Silicon Valley, they're all lefties. Not so much on economic issues, but on everything else, they basically almost unthinkingly adopt a progressive mindset about anything ranging from family to marriage to the role of government, etc., etc. So that's the irony is that that the free trade thing doesn't cut the conservative progressive divide that many people think that it does. Yeah. Although if you compare, for example, the Republican platform in 2016 with the Democratic platform in 2016 on free trade, the Republican platform is clearly more free trade, but if you read it very closely, you can see that the rise of economic populism has had an effect on the way that the conservatives, the Republican Party, talks about that issue. If you read the Democratic platform, it may as well have been written by Bernie Sanders when it comes to this issue.
So where do you think we should go in terms of thinking about how to help young Americans especially think more clearly about the complexity of a system of political and economic freedom kind of embedded in a certain kind of moral framework?
Well, I think the key is the last few things that you mentioned, the moral framework and the constitutional framework and the institutional framework, all of which I guess is in some sense the political framework. And typically what you find with younger people who are exposed to free market ideas or ideas about free trade, etc., is that not a lot of attention is given to that contextual, institutional and moral and constitutional and political context, which you all need if you want all the good things that economic freedom can bring us. And I think that the American founding in many respects is something that would help people to know much more about, because I think it provides the context for a lot of these good things that we see that free market economies produce. I also think that having a deeper understanding of how property, rule of law, and limited government are essential if you want to have a free market economy, but also that free market economies at some level depend upon people freely choosing to live good lives, right? Because unless you have, for example, businesses who are run by good people who take their responsibilities as an employer seriously, who don't just see their employees as instruments to be used, but rather as people who are potentially creative, who can do great things if you give them enough freedom. Unless you have that type of moral culture in place, then when it comes to dealing with problems, people will tend to resort to the government. They'll tend to resort to regulation because that's the only alternative in the absence of a strong moral culture that's capable of sustaining some of these political, moral, and cultural institutions, which is why your work is so important in dealing with these things.
Yours too. It's been great having you, Sam. It's wonderful to have this conversation, and we look forward to having many other conversations with future speakers. Again, I'm Christopher Wolfe, President of the American Public Philosophy Institute, and we look forward to seeing you on other occasions in the future.